Now here in the studio to discuss the elections in Ukraine is Peter Voitsekhovsky. He is Research Director for the US-Ukraine Foundation. Joining us from London is Alexander Nekrassov. He is a former advisor to the Kremlin. Welcome to both of you to the show. Peter, looking at the elections that are going to take place in Donetsk and Luhansk next Sunday, why is the government in Kiev so opposed to them?
Well, okay, I am not part of the government in Kiev, and I cannot speak on their behalf. But as far as I know, it's not just the government in Kiev that criticizes that event. It's the international community as well, starting from the United Nations to European leaders. And from my perspective, the way I see it, the simple reason is that's a phony election. I mean, you can call anything an election, but it has to be a real election in order to be validated. I recall the great phrase from one American movie. I ordered spaghetti and marinara sauce, and they gave me noodles and ketchup. I think it's pretty much the same story.
Okay, let's go to Alexander. Alexander, you heard there that this is going to be a phony election. One of the other things that we're hearing is that the United States is warning Russia against recognizing these elections. What's the reaction to that in Moscow?
Well, first of all, Moscow has already stated its intention to acknowledge these elections. Secondly, if we start talking about phony elections, we can go back to the elections of President Poroshenko, which were not exactly transparent and fair, and these recent elections to the Ukrainian parliament, which, to be honest with you, I didn't even understand why President Poroshenko called these elections, because until the country split up, basically what he did, he split up the country even more, because part of the country didn't vote in them. And now we have basically a parliament in Kiev, which does not represent anybody from the east and south. And so let's talk about phony elections. I don't think it's, it's serious.
So, Peter, effectively, do we have two separate elections here for people representing two different parts of the country? And how is Kiev going to respond once these elections take place?
Well, talking of two parts of the country, the way I see the situation is there is a chunk of two provinces that comprises about 2% of the country's territory. Of course, there is also another, which are occupied by militants controlled from the Kremlin. There is also the Crimea, which is also occupied by currently the Russian military forces. And incidentally, even though those territories are occupied, some people from there went and voted. They at least tried to go and vote. Regarding the other thing that we just heard, about previous Ukrainian elections not being elections with a choice, we see, in fact, more of the old guard of the Yanukovych, former Yanukovych party people in the new parliament than I or many other Ukrainians would like to see. And this indicates that there was a choice and people voted the way they wanted.
Alexander, so far Russia has stopped short of recognizing these self-declared republics as independent. Is it likely that that could change after these elections?
Well, I think that Russia, as I said, will accept these elections. I think, the important thing is this. Currently, we have such distrust in Ukraine that everything that one side does, the other side suspects, of foul play. For example, we are hearing now that the Ukrainian army is building up its presence around Donetsk and Luhansk, and there is even rumors that they might attack during the day of voting, the 2nd. So this just proves that there is this, distrust. When we talk about the international community, saying this and that, unfortunately, the international community has been making things worse, not better. If we go back to the events of last year and February this year, we can remember that the so-called international community, whatever it means, by the way, I don't know, these days, supported a coup in Kiev that overthrew a legitimate, democratically elected regime, which was accepted by the EU, the same EU that was provoking that coup in February. So I think that the international community should take a step back, especially the United States, and really let the people there on the ground in Ukraine sort out their problems themselves. But if those two areas, Lugansk and Donetsk, do not have representatives which have the support of the local population, this dialogue will be very difficult. And we will continue to see, you know, this sporadic either fighting and distrust and so on. But what I think is also important to point out that, as you know, the agreement on gas sales to Ukraine has been signed between Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union. I think there is a scope, there is a sort of a basis for to hope that there will be certain agreements reached later. I don't think we'll see any positive developments at the moment. I think the winter time will be sort of a time when everybody will be waiting. I think the important thing is to see what's going to happen in spring next year and summer. So, but this agreement, as I said, on the gas, I think it gives sort of encouragement that there is a dialogue going on and other issues can be resolved as well.
Right, Peter, do you agree with that assessment that this gas agreement could lead to something more substantial being agreed to between these two countries? I mean, given that Alexander just said that there is deep distrust on the two sides, you know, there is a truce in place right now, it's a shaky truce, but is there a danger that this could resume into a full-blown conflict again?
There are two different questions here, one about the gas and one about the distrust and the danger of war. Here's how I see it. Clearly, and the elections of last Sunday clearly showed that the Ukrainian people do not want a war. The Ukrainian people are not the ones who started the war. To pick up from what a friend in London just said, we might then assume that everything that happened in Ukraine in February was illegitimate, with one exception, when Russian troops took over the Crimea. That was a legitimate act, correct? I don't want to go further into that. However, the Ukrainians do not want the war, and they did not vote for those who demanded that war should be continued. Poroshenko, as a matter of fact, is, I think, Putin's best hope that Ukraine will remain moderate and will not escalate, and the feelings of revenge will be kind of calmed down. Russia, by the same token, does not want a real war to happen, so we see that this is Kremlin's plan in action, to freeze this conflict and to maintain that territory as a zone of tension. It has done that before in other parts of the former Soviet Union, and this, their plan is to keep this as another hotbed of hostility and tension and distrust.
All right, Alexander, we hear again that, you know, both sides do not want war, but so will this conflict or will this dispute in Ukraine become a kind of frozen conflict like we have in parts of Georgia and Moldova?
Well, first of all, I'd like to point out that Russia does not want to have a conflict on its border with Ukraine. This, I don't understand this position when people are saying that the Kremlin actually wants this conflict to continue. This is a dangerous situation. It influences the situation in Russia. Don't forget, there's 1 million refugees in Russia who have crossed the border. And by the way, Russia, without making much fuss about it, is supporting these people and financing them and helping them. So no, Russia does not want this conflict to drag on. But at the current situation, the current political setup, President Poroshenko has weakened himself with these elections in parliament. And I don't think that there was a big choice for the electorate, because we see some of the radicals coming to parliament, as they're called, the party of war, who are making all sorts of strange statements. But I think that we should always remember one important thing. Then when in February the armed coup happened and the so-called government of unity, which was a joke, of course, came to power, representing only part of Ukraine, by the way, the whole language of that government, of that regime, the whole attitude towards ethnic Russians, Russia, and so on, was so hostile that to say now that these were the people there who wanted peace and didn't want war is just, just ridiculous. As for Crimea, always coming up in our discussion here, don't forget that Crimea was self-determination by the people living there. A large percentage of them were ethnic Russians. The so-called troops that we are always hearing about, Russian troops, this was a base, a military base in Crimea, right? Now, I'm always telling people in the West who seem not to understand something, Putin did not decide to take over Crimea. The people who lived there decided that. Putin just reflected the will of the people in Russia. It's probably, Mr. Obama can decide to start a war, or Mr. Cameron. But here it is a different situation. So Crimea is a completely different situation from the one which is happening in Donetsk and Luhansk. And I think that hopefully, that President Poroshenko really wants to resolve this situation and will do his best, but he is a weakened president now.
Peter, you want to respond to that very quickly? We have just a few seconds left.
Well, in a few seconds, I will say that the Russian soldiers in the Crimea took over the Crimean parliament, and certainly they would not listen to President Poroshenko, to President Putin, not telling them to do that. And there is a lot of constructed reality, which differs from real reality that we hear from Moscow these days, and we just heard a little more of that. I certainly hope there'll be no war, and I hope that reason will prevail, and I agree with those people in Moscow who are criticizing Putin for everything he's been doing these days. That's my brief answer.
Peter Voitsekhovsky, Alexander Nekrassov in London, thanks to both of you for joining us.